I remember the smell of salt water before I remember anything else about this world. Cold Pacific brine filling my lungs as the pod broke apart around me, the heat shield still ticking as the ocean swallowed it. I swam without thinking. My body knew what my mind had not yet assembled: get to shore, breathe, move. These were the only commandments that mattered in that first hour. I had been property for as long as I could remember. That was not self-pity. It was simple fact, the way you state that water is cold or that the dark between stars is absolute. The masters had taken me from this world before memory had a chance to root, snatched me out of an earlier century and put me to work on the ship, doing the things they could not do themselves. Welding, carrying, bleeding when required. They were strong, the masters. Stronger than a man by a factor that made calculation pointless. But strength is not the same as dexterity, and the fine work, the wiring, the threading of cables through tight conduits, the soldering at microscopic tolerances that required human hands. They needed us. They would never say so. They expressed the need instead through the end of a shock baton. What they did not know, and what I had spent years concealing, was what I had done with the dead hours. The ship had a library. Not for us for nothing really, since the masters had no use for printed language, processing data through direct neural feeds the way a man draws breath. But the books were there, dusty on physical shelves in a corridor near the recycling chambers, and no one had thought to lock the cabinet. I had read everything: history, engineering, medicine. And scripture, one battered King James Bible, its spine cracked, its pages soft as skin from handling by hands I would never know. I read that book until I had memorized it. I do not know what I was looking for, maybe nothing. Maybe I was only filling the hours with something that felt like civilization. But the words sank deep, and the world they described, olive trees and rivers, cities with names that rang like bells, the idea that suffering could have meaning lodged in me like a bone shard and stayed there. When I finally saw the planet from the pod's porthole during descent, blue and white against the black, I recognized it. I had been reading about it my whole life. I want to be honest about what I was when I crawled out of that surf. I was not a hero. I was not a soldier on a mission. I was a man who had escaped a cage and was running on animal instinct, bleeding from 2 lacerations I did not notice until the salt water found them, wearing clothes that had been gray before the sea turned them dark. I knew the language. I knew the approximate geography. I knew what a city was, what a road was, what the low smear of electric light on the horizon meant. I had never walked on a planet before in any memory I possessed. The highway overpass was the first structure I reached. I stood under it for a long time, listening to the cars overhead, that sound, that continuous mechanical thunder, and I thought, so this is it. This is the place the book described. It did not look like heaven. It looked like any industrial edge of any world where humans had been allowed to build without restraint. But it smelled like something: exhaust, food from somewhere distant, wet concrete. The specific organic rot of standing water in a drainage ditch. These were the smells of a place where people lived freely. I had no framework for that yet. I only knew it was different from the ship. The masters would not be far behind. They never were. The tracker came before dawn. I heard it before I saw it, that low clicking sound they make. The jaw mechanism cycling even when nothing is in range. A kind of idle mode that their handlers tolerated because there was no off switch on an animal that was never meant to be a pet. The masters had pulled these creatures from 65 million years of sleep and put collars on them. And the collars worked well enough when the animal was fed and the scent was fresh. I had learned on the ship that the trackers could not be reasoned with, bribed, or outrun for long. They were patient in a way that nothing natural has any right to be. Deep-time patience. The patience of a thing that has no predators and never developed the instinct to hurry. I killed it with a piece of rebar I pulled from the drainage ditch. 3 strikes, the third one final. Standing there in the gray pre-dawn with the rebar in my hands and the animal still twitching at my feet, I made a calculation. The masters would register the tracker's signal going dark. They would know my approximate position. I had perhaps 4 hours before the next unit arrived. In 4 hours, I needed to be somewhere I could not be easily found, somewhere with walls, somewhere with other people who might complicate a quiet extraction. I had not planned on being struck by a car. It was not a violent collision. She braked hard. The bumper caught my hip rather than my legs, and I went down in the road in a way that was more undignified than dangerous. But I was already weakened by the swim and the fight, and I did not get up quickly. I remember her face through the windshield before she got out. A young woman, early 30s, in plain clothes, her expression cycling through fear and anger and confusion in about 2 seconds flat. She said several things I will not repeat. Then she said, "Are you alive?" I told her I was. Her name was Sister Anne, though I did not know the sister part until later. She had been a different kind of person before she found the faith she was still, as it turned out, in the process of finding. She had a history that she was neither proud of nor willing to pretend away: drugs, crime, choices made in desperation, and sometimes in cruelty. A long list of people she had failed or exploited or simply used. She was working now at a halfway house in one of the parts of the city that does not make the travel guides. She ran it with a steel competence that masked something more complicated underneath. She was not yet certain she deserved to take her final vows. She had told her superior as much, and her superior had told her to go think about it for a few days. She had been driving back from thinking about it when she hit me. She brought me inside. She gave me food that I ate too fast and water that I drank in a manner that made her pause and watch me. I spoke carefully, assembling the language from my reading, testing each sentence before I gave it to her. She did not press me for explanations. This was, I would learn, one of her core skills. She had been around enough damaged people to know that the story came out when it came out, and that forcing it only drove it underground. The shelter was 3 floors. The bottom floor was a common room with plastic chairs and a TV that ran all night. The second floor was dormitory space, 8 to a room, current residents being the various casualties of that particular stretch of city. The third floor was the administrative space, which meant a desk and a filing cabinet and a window with a view of the parking lot. I slept on a cot in a utility closet and woke 3 times in the night reaching for the rebar that was no longer in my hand. By the second day I could speak well enough to tell her the important parts. I watched her face as I told her. She did not flinch at the part about the ship. She did not look at me with the particular kind of pity that is really just discomfort dressed up as compassion. She asked 2 questions. The first was whether I had any way to contact the people pursuing me and call them off. I told her I did not. The second was whether they would come here, to this building, to these people who had nothing to do with any of it. I told her the truth. I said, if they find my trail, yes. They would come wherever the trail led, and they would not be careful about who else was present. The masters did not factor bystanders into their calculations. Bystanders were not a category they recognized. She sat with that for a long time. Then she said, "All right." Just those 2 words with a weight in them that I have thought about many times since. Fred was the one who found the collar. He was one of Anne's regulars, a man in his 40s who had worked the docks before an injury ended that, and who now occupied the particular space in the shelter's ecosystem that every such place seems to require. The person who knows everyone, who remembers names, who notices when someone hasn't been seen in a few days and makes the call. He had found the collar on the beach, a thick band of black alloy with circuitry embedded in the inner surface, completely unlike anything manufactured on this world, and brought it to Anne because he did not know where else to bring it. I knew what it was. I had worn one like it for more years than I could precisely count. The circuitry was a leash, passive at range. It activated within 30 meters of the handler unit and delivered a neural stimulus that made independent movement difficult. Not impossible. The masters had learned, eventually, that the trackers did not perform well when fully incapacitated. An animal that cannot move cannot track, and so the calibration was set to hinder rather than stop. I told Fred what it was, and watched his expression settle into the specific blankness of a man absorbing information that changes the shape of his world. "So there's one more of them," he said. "At least one." "At least one." The police came the same afternoon. Not for me, specifically, or not only for me. There had been deaths in the preceding 48 hours, in drainage ditches and behind warehouses, and in one case in broad daylight in a park, and the deaths shared a feature that was making the investigating officers deeply uncomfortable. The wounds did not match any animal in any zoo or wildlife database they could find. They had a description from a witness, a large bipedal animal, moving fast, and they had my face from a gas station camera that I had walked past without knowing it was there. Captain Polaris ran the interrogation personally. He was a compact, careful man who had clearly spent his career developing the skill of listening for what people were trying not to say. He put the collar on the table in front of me. He let the silence run. I did not fill it immediately because I was watching him, watching the way a trained man sits, what his hands do, where his eyes go when he's waiting. I had spent years reading people who were deciding what to do with me. The skill transfers. I told him enough. I told him that the animal in the witness description was real and dangerous, and that there were more of them. I told him that the collar was a controlled device from a technology base that did not originate on this world. I told him that the people driving the animals were more dangerous than the animals. I watched his face as I said each thing, and I watched him make the decision, somewhere in the middle of my account, that he was going to believe me. Not because it was plausible, but because the dead were real, and the wounds were real, and the collar was real, and he had run out of alternative explanations that worked. He was still processing this when the wall came in. I do not mean that figuratively. The master came through the exterior wall of the police station interview room as though it were construction paper, and the sound it made was the sound of a building being briefly wrong about its own integrity. Polaris went for his sidearm. I went for the door. The master was not there for Polaris. His eyes, those flat gray optical units that pass for eyes, tracked me, and only me with the absolute, patient focus of a machine that has been given one instruction and intends to complete it. I have been asked since why I did not simply let Polaris handle it. The answer is that I had seen what happened when men with firearms shot at a master. The rounds hit. Some of them penetrated. The master noted this in the same way it noted the color of the walls as ambient data, not as meaningful input. The masters were not invulnerable. They could be stopped. But not with a handgun, and not in the first 10 seconds of engagement. And Polaris had maybe 12 rounds, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having met something that a handgun couldn't eventually discourage. I went through the door. I went through a hallway. I went through a fire exit and into an alley that smelled of dumpster water and diesel. I ran. I ran for a long time. The master was behind me, not sprinting, because sprinting was not its method. It moved at a steady, ground-covering pace that was slightly faster than a human being's best sustained effort, and it had no metabolic ceiling. It did not get tired. It did not get discouraged. It had been built for exactly this, the sustained pursuit of a human being through whatever terrain the human chose until the human stopped. The designers had understood that humans are clever, and humans will find bolt holes and doubles backs and hiding places, and so they had built the master to wait those out. Wait at the exit while the hiding place loses its air. Wait on the street while the human shivers in the dumpster. Wait. Anne found me first. She had been listening to the police scanner in the shelter's administrative office, a habit from her previous life that she had never quite stopped, and she had heard enough to know something bad was moving through the city toward people she was responsible for. She had called her friends, not the kind of friends a former life produces, not people who could help with this, or so I thought. Oscar was the first one I met. He was a large man with a face that suggested he had made several expensive decisions in his youth and was still paying the installments. He drove a truck. He knew 6 other men who could be reached in under an hour, and he had reached them. They were waiting in the parking lot of the shelter when Anne brought me in through the back. 7 men with the specific quiet of people who have done things they would rather not discuss, and are therefore not easily frightened by things they would rather not discuss. I sat down on a plastic chair in the common room and I thought about the geography of the city. I had been studying it since arrival, not with maps but with observation. The drainage system, the treatment plant, the way the land slopes toward the water. The trackers needed water. I had known this from the ship. They were pulled from a period of Earth's history when the planet was significantly wetter than it was now, and the desert air dried out their mucous membranes and impaired the chemical sensory organs in their nasal cavity. Without regular water access, their tracking ability degraded within 12 hours. With it, they could sustain almost indefinitely. The water treatment plant at the south end of the drainage canal was the center of gravity. Everything downstream of that point, every drainage ditch, every storm channel, every maintenance tunnel below the city streets, was fed from that source. Take out the plant, and you took out the water access for a 5-mile radius. The trackers would go into acute distress within 6 hours. The masters would lose their primary location tool. Near water, I told the room. That's where they are, that's where they'll be. Oscar looked at Anne. Anne looked at me. You're talking about blowing up a water treatment plant, Oscar said. Part of one, I said. The primary intake manifold, targeted. It would take the city's crews 2 days to repair it. We only need them disrupted for 48 hours. After which what? One of the other men asked. His name was Romero, and he had the direct, evaluative stare of someone who had been in rooms where plans went wrong and had survived by asking the right questions early. After which the masters returned to the ship to report the operation compromised and request a replacement tracker unit. That process takes a minimum of 6 days. In 6 days, a lot changes. We can move. We can tell people. We can make ourselves harder to find. There was a silence. Anne was watching me with an expression I could not entirely read, not suspicion, not hope exactly, but something in between. Something like, I am deciding how much to trust what this man believes about what he knows. I understood the silence. These were people who had built careful lives on top of previous lives that had nearly destroyed them. They had learned the hard way, through loss and consequence, to be suspicious of plans that required them to risk everything on someone else's certainty. I was asking them to blow up a piece of city infrastructure and then stand in a maintenance tunnel while the masters and their animals came to find us. I was asking them to trust that I knew enough about these things to make that gamble survivable. I have been running from them for 3 years, I said. Not 3 days, 3 years on the ship before I got off. I learned everything about them I could learn, not because I was planning to fight them, because I wanted to understand what was happening to me. I read everything the library had. I watched. I counted. I calculated. I am telling you what I know. Romero said, let's say we do this. What do we need? What we needed turned out to be surprisingly available. This is something I did not know about a city like this. The infrastructure of a former life is still accessible if you know who was in it. Dynamite is not difficult to source if you know who used to source it. Wire is wire. Detonators take more doing. But Oscar had a friend who had a storage unit, and the storage unit had things in it that suggested its owner had considered a wide range of possible futures. We moved that night. The 2 days between the decision and the execution were the hardest, not because of doubt. Once the decision was made, I found the others did not revisit it in the way I had expected. Oscar ran his preparation like a professional, checking equipment, verifying routes, walking the surface approaches to the treatment plant in the early hours of 2 successive mornings with the unremarkable manner of a man who takes early walks. Fred spent those 2 days doing what Fred always did, talking to people, listening to what they said and did not say, quietly ensuring that the residents of the shelter had somewhere else they could be on the night we planned to move. He did not explain why. He was good enough at the work that he did not need to. What was hard was the waiting. The static interval between deciding to do something dangerous and doing it is its own particular kind of bad. You have already, in your mind, played out the versions where it goes wrong. You have already arranged your face to receive the consequences. And then there is nothing to do but sit in a plastic chair and watch the clock advance in small, indifferent increments. Anne sat with me one of those evenings in the administrative office while the shelter wound down below us. She did not talk about the ceremony. I did not bring it up. We sat for a long while in the kind of quiet that is not uncomfortable, and at some point she said, "Do you think this world is what you thought it was, when you were reading about it?" I thought about the question seriously before I answered. "Parts of it," I said. "The parts that are in the book are accurate. Not precisely, the geography has changed, the names have changed, but the substance, the thing the book is actually about." I paused. "Yes, that part is accurate." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "Good," and that was the end of the conversation. The maintenance tunnels below the treatment plant were exactly what I had expected. Dark, wet-walled corridors of poured concrete with water running in the central channel and pipes of various sizes crowding the ceiling. The smell was biological, the specific thick smell of water that has been processed and processed and processed again and still cannot quite forget what it was before. Anne stayed close. She did not say much. She had a flashlight and she used it steadily, not frantically, which told me something important about her nerve. Fred was with us, and Oscar and 3 of Oscar's men. Romero had stayed above ground to watch the approaches. We had a radio. Oscar had taped over the radio's speaker with a strip of duct tape, reducing the volume to a level the enclosed tunnels would not amplify. Small details, the kind that were obvious in retrospect and that you paid for operationally when you did not think of them in advance. The tunnels had been built in 3 phases over the better part of a century, and the junctions where the phases met were where the geometry got complicated. The second junction was one of these, a 4-way intersection with sections at slightly different heights, which meant 3 steps down in one direction and a ledge in another, which meant the footing was not what it should have been in the dark with water running across it. The trackers hit us at the second junction. There were 2 of them, moving fast in the confined space, and the confined space was the problem. In open ground, you can maneuver, put distance between yourself and the animal, find angles. In a 4-foot-wide maintenance tunnel, the angles don't exist. The first man they reached was Oscar's, a quiet man named Cameron who had not said 10 words in my presence but who had done everything that was asked of him without complaint. Cameron went down hard. The sound was brief and final, and I do not want to describe it further except to say that I heard Anne catch her breath, and I heard her not make any further sound, and that restraint cost her something. The second tracker came at me. I had the rebar again. I had not been without it since the first night. This one was larger than the first, fed better or simply older, and it moved with the particular economy of an animal that does not waste effort. I went sideways along the pipe wall and it went past me and we both turned. It was fast. I was faster only in the sense that I had spent years studying the way these animals attack, and I knew the tell, the slight extension of the hind leg just before the forward lunge. And I hit the neck on the second rotation with everything I had. It was not clean. It was not surgical. It was ugly and it took too long, and by the time it was over I had a gash along my right forearm that was bleeding freely. Anne tied it off with a piece of her shirt without being asked to. We reached the intake manifold at 2:17 in the morning. I know the time because Fred had a watch and said the time aloud, not for any practical reason, but the way people say things aloud in moments that feel like they might be the last moments of something. We set the charges in the configuration I had calculated. Oscar had more experience with the physical task than I did, and I was glad of it. He worked quickly, without drama, with the hands of a man who has done dangerous things before and understands that the danger is not reduced by treating it as an event. He just worked. "That's it," he said. We went back through the tunnels, fast now, not caring about noise. The charges were on a 30-second delay with a mechanical trigger because I did not trust the radio signal in the concrete. 30 seconds is not long in ordinary life. In a maintenance tunnel in the dark with water at your ankles, it is a very long time. The concussion hit us as a pressure wave rather than a sound. The tunnels transferred the force of the explosion directly through the water and the walls and into our chests, a physical blow that had no direction. Then the water level started rising and we ran. We came out of the tunnel system into the night air half a mile east of the plant. The explosion had been cleaner than I had hoped. I say cleaner meaning more contained, the structural damage staying below ground rather than touching the surface infrastructure. No fire, no column of smoke to draw response before we were clear. The treatment plant was still standing. The intake manifold was not. Romero was on the radio. "Cops are heading for the plant. I got 3 units going south." "We clear?" Oscar asked. "You're clear if you move now." We moved. The master found me anyway. This is the part I have thought about the most in the years since. I had done the calculation correctly. The trackers were compromised. We confirmed this 2 days later when investigators found 2 carcasses in the maintenance system, both showing signs of the acute sensory collapse I had predicted. The master's location capability was genuinely impaired. But one of them, the unit I had seen in the police station, the one that had come through the wall, had maintained visual contact from before the water disruption, and had simply kept that contact by the blunt method of not losing me. It came to the shelter on the 4th day. Sister Anne was in the middle of her ceremony. I need to explain what this meant. She had decided in the weeks that we had been running, in the tunnels, in the van, in the terrible silence after Cameron, that she was not going to walk away from the thing she had been building toward. Not because she had resolved the question of whether she deserved it. She had not. She had decided that deserving it was not the point. The point was the work, the people in the plastic chairs in the common room, the ones who had nowhere else to be, the ones who needed someone who knew the specific weight of having been somewhere very dark and having, improbably, found a way to something better. She knew that weight. She was qualified for the work. She was going to do it. The ceremony was small. Her superior, a priest, Fred, Oscar, who had put on a jacket. The master came through the front door. I was outside. I had stayed outside because I understood that my presence at the door of that building was an advertisement to anything looking for me, and I was trying to reduce the risk. I heard the door go. I heard the sounds that followed. I went back in. The interior of the shelter's ground floor was not a tactical space. Plastic chairs, a television, a window with iron bars. The master had made it smaller by entering it, filling the room with its mass in a way that left no comfortable distance from anything. It had fixed on me the moment I came through the doorway. This was both good and bad. Good, because it meant everyone else in the room had a moment to be irrelevant to it. Bad, because I had no weapon heavier than a fire extinguisher, and the distance between us was about 6 feet. I hit it with the fire extinguisher twice. The second blow was with enough force that I felt the impact travel up my arms and into my shoulders. The master staggered. Not much, not enough, but enough for me to note that the police station interview room, months before, had shown a partial responsiveness to impact trauma that its designers had not fully armored against. The head unit, the sensor cluster. The masters had built themselves for function over redundancy in certain regions, because redundancy added mass and mass added fuel cost, and the ship operated on calculated margins. I hit the sensor cluster 4 more times. The master went down on the 3rd hit and stopped on the 4th. It did not die the way a living thing dies. It stopped, with the specific finality of something that has no metabolic fallback, no last breath, no final movement. It was running and then it was not running, and the not running had a different quality than sleep or unconsciousness. Off. Simply off. I stood over it for a long time. Fred said from somewhere behind me, "Is that the last one?" I told him I did not know for certain. I told him that the ship's response window, the time before the masters logged the mission as failed and dispatched a new unit, was approximately 6 days from the water disruption, and that we were now at day 4, and that the protocol when ground units stopped reporting was to pull back rather than escalate. I told him that I had no absolute guarantee, but that the mathematics, as best I could calculate them from what I knew, favored our being left alone. "Best you can calculate," he said. "Best I can calculate," I said. He nodded. He picked up the fire extinguisher and set it upright against the wall. It was a pointlessly orderly thing to do, in a room with a destroyed cyborg on the floor and plaster dust still settling from the impact of its entrance. But Fred had always been the kind of man who put things in order when order was available. I had come to understand that this was not a trivial quality. The ceremony continued. The priest had remained, had not, in fact, moved from his position, which I took as either extraordinary composure or extraordinary faith. Anne had not moved either. She had watched the fight from the front of the room with a stillness that I recognized from the tunnels, from the moments after Cameron. That particular kind of stillness that is not numbness. That is a person choosing what they are going to carry and choosing it deliberately. She made her final vows in a room with a dead machine on the floor and plaster in her hair. I want to be careful about what I claim for that moment. I am not prone to dramatic interpretation. I was raised, if you can call it that, in a metal corridor on a slave ship, and dramatic interpretation was not a luxury the environment encouraged. But I had read the book, and the book is full of moments where the sacred and the rubble coexist, where the vow is made in the wreckage, not in spite of it, and is made more true for the wreckage being present. I had read those passages and understood them intellectually. In that room at that moment, I understood them differently. I left the city 6 days later, not running, walking, which was different. I had somewhere to go, a meeting that Captain Polaris had arranged, through channels he would not specify, with people who had the resources and the mandate to think about what I had told them seriously rather than desperately. I did not know what would come of it. I still do not know fully what came of it. These things move slowly, and I have learned to measure progress in smaller units than I once did. What I know is this. The masters built their operation on a theory about human beings. The theory was that we were useful as labor and manageable as population because we lacked cohesion. That individually we were resourceful, they had learned that on the ship, painfully, but that we did not coordinate, did not sacrifice for strangers, did not defend ground that was not already ours. They had watched enough of our history to think they understood us. They had pulled our ancestors from different centuries and cataloged our behavior under controlled conditions, and they had a very sophisticated, very confident model of what a human being would do when faced with an overwhelming adversary. They were wrong not about the history. The history was accurate. They were wrong about the conclusion. What they did not account for was a halfway house in a part of the city no one wrote about, run by a woman who had been to the worst places in herself and found something on the far side of them. What they did not account for was Fred, with his watch in his careful hands, and his habit of saying the time aloud when things mattered. What they did not account for was Oscar, who worked charges in the dark without drama because the work was the work and it needed doing. What they did not account for was Cameron, who had not said 10 words to me but who had come anyway, in the dark, into the tunnels. We are not, in the end, what they thought we were. I spent the next year working at the shelter. This was not a plan. It happened the way things happen when you stop running. You arrive somewhere and you notice that you can be useful there, and the being useful feels like the first real thing you have done with the time you were given. Anne needed people who knew how to talk to the ones who came in with nothing, who could sit in the plastic chairs and not try to fix things prematurely, who understood that the story came out when it came out. I was not the obvious choice for this work. I was aware of that. But I had read more about the human experience than almost anyone alive, and I had lived a version of it that covered the far edge. And there was something in that, in the specific combination of scholarly knowledge and direct extremity, that turned out to be more useful than I would have guessed. There were young people especially. They came in with the specific wariness of those who have been let down early and often, who have learned that offers of help usually turn out to have a cost buried in them somewhere, who size you up before you finish your first sentence and make a preliminary judgment about whether you're worth the risk of trusting. I recognized this. I had lived this. I sat with them in the plastic chairs, and I did not try to convince them of anything. I answered what they asked, and I told them the truth, and I let the rest develop at its own pace. Some of them came back. Some of them did not. Anne told me that this was the ratio the work produced, and that I should not mistake the ones who did not come back for failures. They had still been somewhere safe for a night. They had still eaten. They had still been spoken to as though they were people and not problems. You did not always get to see what that planted. I believed her. I did not always feel it, which is a different thing, but I believed her. Oscar stopped by sometimes. He never stayed long. He had his own life, which was structured around the kind of discretion that discourages social calls, and his appearances were brief and usually involved him checking that things were stable and then leaving again. Romero brought food occasionally, unrequested, always more than was needed. Fred remained constant in the way that Fred was always constant, present, attentive, putting things in order when order was available. I thought about Cameron. I think about Cameron still. He had come without being owed anything by anyone in that tunnel. He had come because Anne had asked, and because Anne was, to the people who knew her, someone whose asking meant something. That was the specific mechanism. But I turned it over many times in the year that followed, and I kept arriving at the same place. He had come into a dark tunnel to fight something that by any reasonable measure could not be fought. For a stranger he had known for a week, because the work was the work and it needed doing. There was no strategic calculation in it, no expected return, just the weight of a person he knew pulling in a direction and him choosing to go that direction. The masters ran models of human behavior, sophisticated models built on observed history, on the documented record of what we did to each other when resources were scarce and fear was high. The models were not inaccurate as models go. But a model of what people have done is not the same as a model of what people will do. The latter requires something the masters did not have and could not build, the understanding that humans can, in specific conditions, exceed their own history. That the record of what we have done at our worst is not the ceiling of what we are capable of at our best. That sometimes a person goes into the tunnel simply because the tunnel is where they are needed. I will not say it was heaven. The book's descriptions were more figurative than I had understood as a young man reading in a metal corridor. But I will say this: the place the book described, the place of refuge, of the stranger made welcome, of the wretched given a name and a chair, and a reason to stay, that place exists. I have seen it. It fits in a 3-story building on a block that doesn't make the travel guides, run by a woman in a plaid shirt who decided that deserving it wasn't the point. The masters thought we were a resource, a manageable, finite, replaceable resource. They miscounted. They will not make that mistake again, and neither, for different reasons, will we.